welcome back. And today we have made it to the Renaissance, and this is also the last video that I'm going to be posting this week. Then we'll have a new set next week as we move on to a new and exciting chapter. We'll start looking at music that you'll probably be more familiar with, recognizing some of the names of the eras and so forth. But congratulations, you've made it to the last video for this week. So let's do this. So the Renaissance, this is an important era of exploration and conquest. This is the time where Protestantism is born. So you remember how the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church had divided Christianity? Well, Christianity now divides further into Protestantism, starting with Martin Luther, and divides further, eventually coming down to where we are today. During this era, music was supported by kings and nobles. They would hire musicians to work for them. There were some very specific counterpoint rules that developed. Now, counterpoint is this idea of what notes belong together. Thirds, sixths, and octaves were all good things. This is a third. This is a sixth. Those were considered good things. Fifths and octaves. But things that you were supposed to avoid while writing music, things called parallel fifths, where you have all these fifths that just move one from the other. That was considered bad musical writing at this time. Same thing with parallel octaves. That was considered bad musical writing as well. So we also now, during this era, because keyboard instruments are coming into being and because we're starting to write with these specific counterpoint rules, people are having to figure out how to get instruments in tune. Now, as you know, when we play in West Winds, when we're playing in a specific key, we have to make sure that the thirds, we flatten them a little bit to get them in tune in the sixths and the sevenths, because they'll sound right in tune. Well, the problem is if I change keys, the leading tone there. If I change keys, the notes that we need to flatten are different, which is fine if you're an instrument that can make infinite adjustments. But if you're like a piano where you're stuck with what you're stuck with, what do? This is where we develop equal temperament tuning. What this means is the space from this note to this note to this note. All those spaces are the exact same amount. And that means in certain keys, some notes are a little out of tune, but not much. So this is where this happens. The other exciting thing that happens during this era is the printing press, which means we can print music. And that is a big deal. Now, the reason it's a big deal is because music can now be sold to consumers. People can now do music making at home. They can do it on their own time because the cost of music has come down. It's no longer just being written by the church. It's no longer having to be paid for by wealthy patrons. So now people at home and amateurs are starting to look for music, and they're wanting it. So the rise of secular music comes even further at this point. So now let's talk about some of the composers from this era. One of the great French composers of this era, 15th century composer, was by the name of, and I'm going to probably say this somewhat wrong. There's several names I'm probably going to butcher a little bit today, but his name was Giovanni Palestrina, and he was trained in France, but he also worked in Italy. And the piece that we're going to listen to by him today is called Se la faccia pale. I'm not sure. Something along those lines. Listen to how initially it's homophonic in texture. Remember, that was different notes, same rhythm. And then it becomes polyphonic. So that's going to happen here in this piece that you're going to listen to. This piece, unshockingly, is about love. If my face is pale, it's because I'm in love, blah, blah, blah. Listen for how many voices there are, because you're going to start to hear music that maybe actually starts to sound like it could. It's going to have more connections with music that we have today. It's going to sound, I'm not going to say modern, but it's going to sound less distant than other music we've listened to. If you listen to this all the way through, you're going to hear a lot of repetition. So take a moment to listen to this love song, Se la face ai pale, and then come back and join us again. Another important composer we need to talk about from this era, and again, I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, Josquin des Prez. French again, unshockingly. He is considered one of the absolute greatest composers of this era. We're talking 15th century here. Who, in fact, is so famous that someone that you probably know of once said of him, he was the master of the notes. They must do as he wills. As for the other composers, they have to do as the notes will. What person do you know from this time period? What name do you know of someone famous from this era that might have said that? Someone that loved music. I'll give you a hint. He wrote, "A mighty fortress is our God." If that doesn't help you, try the Reformation and the 95 Theses. Martin Luther. Martin Luther himself said this of Dupré. This is a man that really defined this era of music. He wrote a lot of motets. Now remember, motets were music that have multiple lines of text and melodies going simultaneously. By this era, there's a slightly less rigid definition of that, but that's still the gist of it. He was very creative in how he wrote the music. He wrote melodies that went up or down to paint exactly what the text was saying. He's credited with 133 works, including 18 masses. And remember, a mass is a set of music for a church service. So this is a lot of writing. And what made him unique was he made sure that all the voices were equally important. There's no more boring bottom line. So I want you to listen to this Ave Maria that he wrote, which of course means Hail Mary. See if you can hear the new technique of canon from this era. And you know what a canon is. Think row, row, row your boat. Row, row, row your boat. Row, row, row your boat. You sing the same tune. Different people have the tune, but they start at different times. And it all fits together. There's some great tight harmonies in here. Still no parallel intervals. Other techniques I should just mention before you listen to this that we start to hear are like hemiolas. And if you know what a hemiola is, you got a 3 pattern in one voice and a 2 pattern in the other. So that's a hemiola. Think of what Josh plays in The Gate of Heaven for that accompaniment. So take a listen to this Ave Maria by Josquin des Prez, and then come back and join us again. All right, we're on to another composer, this one from England, William Byrd. Now, if you've been in choir with me in previous years, or Oceanaires, we've done some music by him and by his teacher, Thomas Tallis. Thomas Tallis was the If You Love Me. So, he lived in the 16th century. Now, you have to understand that the 16th century, around this time, this was when Henry VIII was getting all angry because he wanted to divorce his wife because she couldn't bear him a son. But the Pope was like, "No, man, I'm friends with her," I don't know, some relative of hers. And the Pope was like, "You can't divorce her." And Henry was like, "Well, okay then. I'm just gonna, England's just gonna ditch Catholicism. We're gonna start our own religion, which we know as Anglicanism, or the Church of England, which is basically Catholicism, except the king is in place of the Pope." Worked out real well for Henry. So, these were the circumstances you have to understand that Byrd was writing under when he was in England, and Byrd was a Catholic. Yet he was absolutely adored by the Anglican and brief Catholic monarchs that ruled during his lifetime. And he was considered a very important part of their society. This Ave Verum Corpus that he wrote, I want you to look that up next. It's William Byrd's Ave Verum Corpus, which means "Hail true body, born of the Virgin Mary," and then it talks about how his body was crucified. This is an example of his homophonic church music. And since it's church music, it's going to be in what language? Right, Latin. So look up his Ave Verum Corpus, listen to at least some of it, and then come back, and we're going to go on. We have a couple more composers to get through. Another absolutely essential name to know from this era, Giovanni Palestrina. This was a man who made polyphonic music easier to understand. He made the text easier to understand because he was writing for the Catholic churches. They were figuring out how to respond to this Reformation that was going on. They wanted some very good, well-written church music, and his stuff is some of the best church music of the era. Very chant-like in the melodies, was very careful where he put the dissonance. Dissonance are notes that don't go very well together. They clash. So there can be beauty in the use of them, but you don't want an entire song that's all dissonant. You need dissonance to move to consonants, which are notes that match up and go well with each other. That tension between them is what allows the consonants to sound really good. So we start to get a sense, as he's very careful where he puts this dissonance, we start to get a sense of flow and meter that we haven't had before. We're starting to hear something that almost sounds like cadencing. West Winds, you know how that goes. We're going from, we hear phrases, chords that lead naturally to other chords. So we're hearing some of that going on. He uses all kinds of things to get the dissonance into weak spots. He uses what's called passing tones. That G would have been considered dissonant in that chord. So he sticks it in a really weak spot and it passes down from one note to the next. Uses cambiatas, jumps to get to the consonants. On neighboring tones, notes they're right next door and then return. So these are the kinds of things that you're going to hear him using in his music. Wrote over 100 masses, and this is his Agnus Dei, which means Lamb of God. So take a listen to the Agnus Dei by Palestrina and then come back and join us. Now, another type of music that shows up at this time, madrigals. Remember how we said music was being printed? It changed the cost. Now music could be sold to consumers instead of just done as a job for the church. And those amateurs with money, well, at least enough to buy the sheet music, they wanted music. So madrigals are music for social singing in Italian. This was a secular type of music. So, yes, we had love songs up to this point, but this was like the masses now were singing secular music, and the only time they ever sang was in church, so yikes. These songs are what are called through composed. You and I, when we listen to music, we're used to patterns of some kind. We like patterns. They give us a sense of place and where we're going. And so we'll hear a pattern that repeats itself and goes on, either rhythmically or melodically, whatever it might mean. So we have a sense of structure. Here's part A, here's part B, then we go back to part A with new words, then we go to part B, then there's a C, that bridge, then we go back to A and B. We're used to that. Through composed means nothing repeats. Everything's new as you go through. There's no repetitious patterns. I want you to take a listen to this example of a madrigal on here. Originally written for 4 to 6, these over time these developed from being for 4 voices to 5 to 6, and they inspired similar genres in other countries. The madrigal I want you to listen to right now is De la Bella Contrade. Listen to this and tell me how it makes you feel, or at least think it, because you can't tell me because this is a video. Think of how this makes you feel, and then let's talk about the emotion it was supposed to evoke from listeners at the time. So how did that make you feel? Did it sound kind of happy? I thought it sounded on the happier side, but the thing is about music at this time, thirds and sixths represented bitterness. So this was kind of a sad, bitter song is actually what it was. That sounds very happy to me. But that was considered sad and bitter, which just goes to show us how contextualized our interpretation of musical sounds is. What we are accustomed to hearing, what we associate with happy, is not what everyone else necessarily associates with happy. So that's just something to keep in mind regarding the sound of music and sometimes the arguments we get over whether something sounds appropriate or not. Think about the context you're in and the culture. How's it going to make your audience feel? Anyways, moving on. Because, again, social playing was taking off, the other thing that took off with it was, get ready, hold on to your seats, social dancing. Which means instrumental music starts to take off as well because you need instruments to dance to. People played usually in groups of similar instruments, a lot of stringed instruments, a lot of wind instruments. You didn't have these great big ensembles with all types represented usually. This is when the violin shows up in the 16th century. The lute, which is a kind of like, it was part of the violin family, but it has some passing resemblance to a guitar, appears. We also have the sackbut, which is so much fun to say. It's basically an early trombone. And then we have the crumhorn, a double-reeded instrument that sounds a little bit like a bagpipe. Keyboard instruments are now getting closer and closer to resembling the harpsichord and piano that'll show up later. The organ is around, and there are all kinds of dance songs that show up. So I want you to take a listen now to this last dance piece, and I believe this is the last slide I have. These are French types of dances, pavane and galliard. You'll hear a lot of repetition in them. So I want you to listen to this pavane de abbreviated and see what you think.